And we're live. Great.
Okay.
So welcome. This is episode 1 of Invite Only with HareClub. We have Dr. Afiya with us. The premise of this episode is we're going to be talking about mental health. So let's jump right in. Dr. Afiya, welcome. Thank you for being a part of this and actually, joining us. Why don't we learn a little bit about you? Could you tell us a little bit about yourself?
Sure. So I'm a clinical psychologist and also a hairstylist. So I really feel honored to be invited on this episode, considering the things that I love: psychology, mental health, and hair. And so I'm a professor at the University of the District of Columbia in Washington, D.C. I am also a hairstylist at N Natural Hair Studio in Silver Spring, Maryland. And I am a research scientist. So I actually study the psychological significance of hair.
Wow.
So that's what I do.
Nice. Nice.
That's awesome. How did you get into the field? What made you want to become a psychologist, and how did you start as a hairstylist?
Okay, well, they actually kind of go together. When I was in college, I actually wanted to be a dentist. I was not interested in anything else, but I hated all of my math and science classes. So in my first semester, and so my second semester, I let my friends pick all of my classes. And they put me in a psychology class, and this psychology class was about 500 students. And the professor was this Australian man who just cursed all the time, and I loved it. He was so funny. It made me pay attention. So I started taking more and more psychology classes. And when I was in these classes, I recognized that there were huge mental health disparities when it comes to Black people. Well, one, I didn't have Black professors in psychology, but two, anytime Black people were brought up, it was often in terms of very high rates of different psychological disorders. Like Black men are 6 times more likely to be diagnosed with schizophrenia than other groups. And so I would always hear this information, but wasn't necessarily working with someone who specialized in Black mental health. And so as a result of that, I decided to go to Howard University to really meet with people who understood Black mental health. But in terms of the hair piece, I always loved doing hair. I was, would set up a lawn chair at the family cookouts and do my cousin's hair out in the open in the backyard. Or I was that girl in my dorm room having these like pop-up salons, braiding people's hair and curling it and all of that. And I remember talking to my Aunt Brenda on the phone one day when I was in college, and I was telling her, I said, I don't know if I want to pursue psychology or if I should pursue hair. And she said, well, why can't you do both? Now, I don't know if she meant for me to do both at the same exact time, but that's the way I interpreted it. I'm like, I could do hair and psychology together. And that's when psychotherapy was birthed, in terms of using hair as an entry point into mental health services.
Oh, cool. So can you dive a little deeper into that? You mentioned what the psychological significance of hair is. What did you determine, and how did you determine that those two things go together?
Yeah, well, I was recognizing that, those sessions that I was having in my dorm room were actually therapy sessions. When I was doing someone's hair, we would spend hours and hours together. And the conversations that would happen and the stories that were being told actually were my favorite part, not just creating the hairstyle, but the conversation. So, any trip to the hair salon that I've made, there's tons of conversation. And it oftentimes is advice giving and storytelling and reflection and even health related topics. And so that's really where I've been observing the conversation. I went to the point of, even after I got my PhD in clinical psychology, I ended up going to hair school because I recognize that that's often the most authentic way to enter into mental health services for Black people, the barbershop and hair salon. So I wanted to make sure I had the most authentic training. And it includes touch, right? Something, as a licensed psychologist, I'm not allowed to touch people. But when it comes to hair, that there's an added element of healing there. So yeah, I just feel like it goes really well together.
So can you combine the two in practice? Since, can you have like a hair studio and then also give clinical advice to somebody at the same time, and you said you have that like physical touch. Is that against the rules, or is that within your boundaries?
Okay, good question. You want to make sure I keep my license in both, right? Yeah, so what I've been doing so far is oftentimes training stylists and barbers in mental health first aid. So teaching stylists and barbers how to do active listening skills, how to identify different mental health disorders. So I've developed a training program. I've done some work in the US. I've even taken groups of stylists to Cuba where we can't use our phones or Wi-Fi, and just really get into the structure of how to really listen and how to reflect and how to soothe someone. But in terms of me, I've actually been running therapy groups in the salon and barbershop setting. So in Virginia and Maryland specifically, I've helped to facilitate support groups, stress management groups, relationship groups in that safe space of the barbershop or hair salon. So I'm not necessarily, I realized I was seeing a lot of hair clients, but I realized I preferred the money of the therapy over hair because I make more money
Right.
doing traditional therapy than hair care. So now I'm just more so advising stylists and barbers. Especially since COVID, I have not done anyone's hair this whole time, but I have been seeing clients for therapy virtually.
Yeah. No, as you can see, we haven't seen anybody for our hair either. I'm out here doing my own twist outs, and Mario has.
I don't know.
Yeah.
I'm figuring it out. Yes, I take it as I go. I know you mentioned this early on, like when you were taking classes. I thought this was an interesting figure. You said like men were 6 times more likely to be diagnosed with schizophrenia. Is that like, with that figure, were men actually seeking mental health, like services to be diagnosed like that? Because most of the time we're told that we're not really seeking them at all, and it's a disparity between who's seeking them and receiving them.
Very good question. So Black men being 6 times more likely to be diagnosed with schizophrenia usually comes from the emergency room. So it's not individual psychotherapy that's happening, but when they're mandated to go to the hospital by family, friends, or the police, right? In terms of if someone is having hallucinations or delusions, which are the primary symptoms of schizophrenia. There's a really good book called Protest Psychosis, a history of how schizophrenia became a Black disease that really identifies how the Black Power movement was basically a medical reframing to pathologize Black men in their sense of paranoia. So, someone with schizophrenia can have very heightened sense of paranoia that the police are following me or someone's listening to my phone calls. But the thing is, for Black men, that's true. The police are following you. The FBI could be interfering with your phone calls or things like that, right? We know the COINTELPRO, that's one of the ways that the Black Panther Party was dismantled. And so there are social pressures that create, these sort of highly stressed experiences. For mental health disorders, and specifically schizophrenia, there's something called the diathesis stress model. The diathesis stress model basically means that someone can have a genetic predisposition for a mental health disorder, but the environment has to be stressful for it to come out. And so considering the social structures of, that can manifest different mental health disorders.
Gotcha. Keen, did that break up a little bit?
Yeah, that broke up a little bit at the end. Could you
I
say
was making really great points.
At the end? It was close to the end. It was really good. It was really good.
So you're saying that environmental factors can actually trigger someone's predisposition for schizophrenia and other hereditary mental health issues.
Exactly.
Okay, so even with that, would you say that those illnesses would surface regardless of the environmental impact? So I know that schizophrenia usually comes probably mid-20s, late 20s, and then into like the 30s, and it's more prevalent in women, right? Or is it more prevalent in men?
Well, that's the thing in terms of, you were bringing it up earlier, who actually goes to seek mental health services, right? That women oftentimes have higher rates of diagnosis, not necessarily higher rates of the illness or disease. So there's controversy in actually finding the prevalence rate for men versus women, and especially when it comes to Black men versus Black women in terms of seeking out or trusting mental health professionals to even get treatment.
Gotcha. Interesting.
Why do you feel, well, in your professional opinion, why is it important for men, women, anyone to actually seek out mental health services, seek out therapy?
Okay. I'm a huge fan of therapy. So, I'm going to present a very biased perspective. I feel like therapy is one of the few spaces that you get to unpack how you think and feel. Oftentimes in our conversations with friends or family members, they're going to do this thing of, that happened to me too. Oh, what you need to do is this. And so the thing is, for a therapist, we're not necessarily giving advice. We're creating space for you to solve and process your experiences. And so we can point people in the right direction or help you to go deeper into your self-reflection, but it's a bit different from just regular conversations. So I, even as a psychologist, have been to see psychologists, right? That for me to recognize my emotional wounds, for me to even increase my own self-regulation and self-awareness, for me to process past traumas that I faced being a Black woman in America. I feel like there's so many benefits of working with a really good therapist, because I'm not going to say all therapy is good, right? I think there are bad therapists out there that can actually be harmful. But when you have a healthy relationship with a therapist, that it just feels really good. You get to feel like you get to be yourself, and can almost chart your progress and become more grounded too.
Yeah, I think you raised a good point. It's not about going there to get advice for how to solve problems. You just have to actually explore why you have these problems, why they're occurring, and why do you see them as problems, and what's actually making you stagger in life. Because I went to therapy for about a year, and it was mostly just conversation, but the conversation was us just like drilling down into certain things, so I have a better understanding. So maybe I might have went in with a little bit of anger, but then I got the understanding, and I was like, I don't have to address that person because I understand where they came from. And that was enough healing for me, rather than me just figuring out, okay, I fixed this problem, let's go forward, right? Let's go to the next one. So I remember I showed my friends, like someone had like some meme online and it said, oh, my therapist told me that my need for self-gratification comes from the American capitalistic society. And I was like, that doesn't seem like something a therapist would say, but but it sounds good in the tweet. But I don't know if they diagnose things like that, like, oh, you're having issues because of capitalism. It's like, oh, okay, thank you. Let me go home now. Let me crush capitalism.
Yeah, I definitely saw that one too. I think it was about accomplishments, right?
Yes.
But I think that we can be very accomplishment driven versus really thinking about how to savor our own talents and value ourselves just for being. So I think it's a reframe for sure.
Correct. And just even on this topic of seeking therapy. So Keegan and I are always talking about, okay, so if you want to go to the gym to build weight and lose weight or something like that, or like build muscle, you lift weights, you run, you exercise, you do martial arts, you do whatever you have to do. What are some ways that someone can actually build mental health then? And we can make it specific. Let's make it specific to men right now, because I know you actually have like something on your site around you deal with men's issues. So what would you actually suggest for that, for a man starting out who wants to improve their mental health?
All right. Good question. I feel like that basic elements are self-care are so critical for mental health. So I just saw you drink some water, right? That to be well hydrated is core, because we oftentimes don't recognize some of our stress symptoms or anxiety symptoms too can be a result of dehydration at the most basic level, right? To make sure that you're hydrated. Sleeping, right? In terms of, there's lots of research suggesting that sleep deprivation is almost like being on a drug, that we cannot think clearly, we're on edge, or our feelings can become dysregulated. So yeah, hydration, sleeping, and then even like you were saying, the gym. I highly recommend physical activity and exercise, that for our body to be able to process our sensory information, there needs to be enough blood flow to our brain, and to be able to have physical health, because physical health has a huge connection to our mental health. And then even, I think a big part is eating healthy, right? In terms of eating a nutrient-rich diet. There's research studies, I don't know how well to believe them, that says that eating blueberries, for example, can elevate your mood, cashews, things like that, that are very basic, that sometimes people are missing in their diets. And then even this sort of processing and externalizing of self-talk. So I know that it's oftentimes considered feminine to do journaling, but I think that that externalization process is critical, because we're constantly telling ourselves stories about ourselves, right? And so if we can document those stories about ourselves, we can see the patterns in which we're processing our relationships, or, you know, our worldview, but also we can then disrupt some of those patterns that become toxic or unhealthy. So I always recommend people document their thoughts at the most basic level. So it doesn't have to be some like pink journal with flowers, however a journal, but just to even if it's a composition notebook, just to get some of the information out. It's interesting. I actually think music is very critical. I have been working with a former student for a few years related to hip hop therapy, and especially for Black men, in terms of how to really use hip hop as a form of art therapy, both to compose lyrics and things like that, but also to consume it in terms of allowing certain songs to evoke certain emotional responses that sometimes may be repressed or suppressed, and to create outlets for it to come out. So those are just some of my initial thoughts in terms of eating, sleeping, exercise, hydration, and writing and music at the most basic level, right? That at the minimum to address self-care in order to have some grounding related to mental health.
That's awesome. To that end, like we're speaking about the external, like what you're putting out to, strengthen your mental health. How, how do you feel like based on what we're consuming mentally, like images, movies, music, Mario and I were talking about, like the videos that we see as like recaps and police video of Black men being shot, even today's the 24th, all right. Well, this young man, he didn't die, but the Jacob Blake situation in Wisconsin, like having to watch those videos over and over again, because it seems like it's a recurring thing. As soon as you hear the name, like there's usually footage that comes out right afterwards. And it's hard for us that are really dialed into the news, or we're always on our phones, like whatever. We're always looking at these videos, like, and we're so tuned into all these things that are happening. Killer Mike said it's like murder porn. Like you're constantly watching, you can't turn away. How does that affect your mental health? What are ways that we can, it's hard to disconnect from it, because like, you feel like you need to know, but like how do you stay sane? How do you make sure you're not being desensitized to what's actually happening because you keep seeing it over and over again?
Ooh, this is what is central right now in terms of how to detox and also process trauma, right? Race-related trauma, race-related stress, and vicarious trauma, right? Because you don't have to have, this specific experience with a police officer to have the trauma experience, right? To witness someone's murder can have lifelong impacts and effects. So you're having me think about this 2 books. I like books. But
You see the library behind you.
2 books. One is called The Body Keeps the Score. The Body Keeps the Score. And basically, it's a book that documents how, even if we're not talking about something, it still impacts our physical bodies and stays with us. And then another book by Dr. Joy DeGruy, maybe you've heard of it, called Post-Traumatic Slave Syndrome, which, well, it should really be called Persistent Traumatic Slave Syndrome, in terms of thinking about what happens when we experience race-related trauma that's intergenerational and unresolved, and how it manifests in different symptoms like ever-present anger, vacant self-esteem, and other symptoms that come up. So I don't have a solution. I think that this is part of the work, but one of my approaches to it is something called race narrative therapy. So this is an intervention model that I've been working on, particularly in Black barbershops. So race narrative therapy is a storytelling approach where we can take these traumas that we've observed and witnessed and articulate it. Because a lot of psychologists, I don't know if you've heard this before, but a lot of psychologists say, anything that you don't talk out, you act out. So again, anything you don't talk out, you act out. And so to some degree, if we are able to unpack these racist experiences, racial traumas, and basically see it in a system, then we can attack the system versus being basically drowned by these individual experiences that keep happening. So there are different socio-political techniques to break down these racial traumas, but again, coming together and telling stories so that it gets separated from your body, and the trauma from your body, and gets manifested as words to then reauthor and transform. To say, that Black person was not killed because they were Black, right? They were killed because the police are racist. And even how that language can address what the problems are versus Black people are not the problem, right? And how to create strategies and methodologies. Right now I'm reading Revolutionary Suicide by Huey P. Newton, and just been reading stories like that about fighting against systems of oppression, and specifically police brutality. I found to be extremely empowering during this time period, to think about the different programs that were developed as a result of, police brutality, and how basically healing can only happen when there's certain organizing and action that takes place. We don't heal in isolation, and we can't win in isolation either. So I know that was a whole long story, but basically I'm still trying to figure it out myself too.
No, I think that's
Absolutely.
I think that hit home. You can't heal in isolation. Like, I'm stealing that quote because that really hit hard.
I think for me, I've been avoiding most of those videos. I can't remember the last one I actually watched because it just does something to you. And then then when I don't watch it, some people look at me like, oh, why are you so, like, you should be watching these things. Like, you shouldn't run away from these things. But it's just like, hey man, I can't keep seeing it because I can read about it and it still hurts. Like, there's nothing that's changing for me that's actually going to change or make me feel better about actually watching it. And what you were mentioning earlier about the organization with the Black Panthers and what Hugh P. Newton was doing, that is very empowering to watch, because when I just see people protesting the system, it's like, yeah, you know, no one's going to want to, like, you could protest the system, but it's not going to change it because the system's working. To me, I look at the system's working perfectly. It's designed to do this, right? And that's what I really liked about, I recently just read Malcolm X's book, his autobiography as an adult. And he speaks about, you know, we need lobbies. We need a whole bunch of other things to be organized. We don't need to protest all the time. We can, it's necessary, but we need to actually have systems to combat the systems that exist today. So that's what helps me kind of frame my understanding of the issues, where it's just like, no, my part in this fight is me and Keegan doing talks like this and understanding and diving deeper into these issues, and then also trying to build systems that combat the existing systems today. So it's not done in isolation, but we're trying to just bring it together so we can actually share with a lot of people.
Yeah. I definitely was hugely impacted by Malcolm X. First seeing the movie, by Spike Lee, and even when I read as an adult the autobiography of Malcolm X by Alex Haley, I kept picturing Denzel Washington, right?
Yeah,
I had to tell myself
same.
it's not Denzel Washington, this separate person. But I ended up using the autobiography of Malcolm X as a textbook when I was a visiting professor at Howard University to teach therapy and to teach personality psychology, because his story is so impactful and actually, influenced Hugh P. Newton and influenced all these other African freedom fighters and the Black Power movement. So yeah, these stories can also be healing too.
So even just speaking about, there's, Killer Mike called it murder porn, but then there's also other addictions that we have today. I know you've probably been seeing them as well since you've been in this field for how long now? I forgot. I'm sorry.
So I got my PhD in 2010. So
okay.
So my first psychology class in 2000. I look younger than what I am.
but even
20 years.
So even with you, since you've been practicing for some time, you've seen the rise of social media, right? So what can you tell me about the addiction that some of us have been having with social media and with all these images, especially Instagram coming out in like around 2012? So that was something that you probably saw the rise in. And then also the access to things like pornography to like young men and women, if you want to look at it like that as well. And I'm not a psychologist, I don't know, but I know like these artificial doses of dopamine to our brain kind of numbs us in some type of way. I just want you to kind of expand on that and tell us like what can we do to kind of combat that, especially as we get older and we start having children.
All right, you knew what you were talking about, that there is things are reinforced. You can get high, right, from the media consumption. That pornography, and especially free pornography websites or Instagram, which is free, are designed to become addictive. That at the basic level of like some Pavlovian dog stuff, like it has these associations that become reinforced over and over. So you made me think about the endocrine system. So the endocrine system in the body is basically how we regulate our hormones. But it starts in the brain. So there's something called the HPA axis. I'm about to get real intro to psych right
Let's
now.
Go. Let's go. If you could get a little bit layman with it, then we could get a little bit layman with it.
Okay.
But
that's
just,
okay.
We're
intro
here.
to psych is for non-major. So I'm going to go in my non-major mode. But okay. So the HPA axis, it means the hypothalamus, pituitary gland, adrenals. So the hypothalamus is a almond-sized part of the brain that communicates with the pituitary gland, which is a chickpea. I'm getting real food specific. Chickpea-sized part of our brain that then sends messages back and forth between those. But then it also then communicates with our adrenal glands, like our energy and our things that get us real hype and excited and things like that. So it's interesting how our brains can almost become addicted to like cortisol and getting hype and these things that basically can connect to arousal. And so, you know, whether it is pornography or Instagram, that it's highly arousing. And so that our body often like feeds off of that, but then we can also become depleted because of the overconsumption of media in its various forms. And even if we get real intro to psych with Freud, right, that Freud basically argues that human drives are based on sex and aggression, right? That he could rationalize every single behavior that we do to be a result of either wanting to fight someone or have sex with them. And so I definitely think, you know, a Western approach to media is putting those things up, whether it's, you know, WAP or whatever, like that, it's that sex sells, right? Sex sells. And so I think that those cycles are going to continue to exist in terms of creating more and more enticing things. I don't know what the future holds, if it's going to be some holograms that can show up, and I don't know. I'm not going to get too far. I do watch Black Mirror.
Oh, that show, yeah, that show. I think they held back this recent season because it was too dangerously close to what's going on today with COVID and stuff. So the guy said, "Let me just take a break." But even what you were saying, like, how do you even combat that? Like, I want to be able to. I know there's like different programs to stop you from actually consuming it, but there's no incentive to stop consuming. There's no incentive to stop, you know, at the end of the day, like even if you're like indulging in media such as like CNN or Fox News, they're telling you what you want to hear. So it feels good. So it's feeding you. But then there's no incentive for you to stop doing it because it feels good. And I remember I was talking to a friend earlier and it was like companies or even the government, they need a board of like psychologists, sociologists. So if you want to release something to the general public, they should review it and say, this will be highly addictive. You need to release it with these guardrails so no one can actually be like caught up in it or to get addicted. But at the end of the day, it's all tied back to capitalism. So there was actually a board like that back in like the early 90s, late 80s, but they dismantled it because they felt like it was just useless to have. But
yep. You know what you're talking about. You just trying to get me to say stuff that gets me in trouble, but yeah, you know what's happening.
Yeah, and it's just, you know, I don't know how to like stop it from occurring. I don't know if everyone just needs some type of therapy or just some type of deep understanding on what it's doing to you on like a personal level. Because it is highly addictive, but just like drugs, I mean, if there's no incentive to stop, then why stop? Why stop? It's not risking your life. There's certain drugs that will probably kill you before you can even get to the point, but this is just gonna keep you alive.
Yeah, I guess you're in a trance, though. I guess I even question how alive you are when you're, you know, hyper consuming media in this way. That I definitely feel like I'm in a trance, and I can remember my niece and nephew when they were younger. They're like teenagers now, but when they were younger, the way that they would just stare at the TV, I'm like waving my hand like, can you see me? Like they weren't in their active part of their brains that this is really enticing in a trance. And there are no benefits to capitalism for the media to change it. So whole systems and governments and presidencies are based on social media. These days it's branding, right? That I think in 2008 when Obama was first elected, that he had the highest ranked brand, right? That this is how we function as a country, is almost exclusively through pictures and moving words, right? Even the first movie, The Birth of a Nation, in the early 1900s was first premiered in the White House, right?
Yep.
And the president at the time said it was like watching history with a lightning bolt or something like that.
Yeah.
Just
Yeah.
to even think about, that's the nature of media and film and social media, to construct these narratives that are oppressive and create compliance. So this is a really hard one to address, but just like any addiction, we need to recognize that media addiction or porn addiction is an avoidance technique, right? It's an avoidance strategy. It's a defense mechanism because it makes us pay attention to the unimportant versus addressing the deeper issue or concern. So it really helps people to avoid the most critical parts of their lives. So.
Gotcha.
I had a follow-up question just because, like based on everything that you just said, I just keep going back because Mario's asking, like, oh, like how do you heal from this? How do you like get out of this? And I just go back to what you said earlier, like you can't heal in isolations. So how important do you feel it is to have like a tribe, to have your own support group, to have a team, like, and, like you take, like, let's say somebody like, like Kanye, like somebody that everybody's like, oh, this dude has some mental health problems and probably has access to a team, but maybe that person doesn't want to listen to his team because they're just, like so conflicted and so embattled, like how do you reach that person that needs help? And if you're that member of the team and like the opposite, like how is it important to have like people that are supportive around you to make sure that you're level and you're balanced?
Great question. Yeah, it's critical how we choose our team and then also how we maintain the teams, right? Because it's sometimes really hard to be in a tribe if we don't have the skill sets to work together. Mario, can I tell a story about when I went to Nigeria?
Sure. No slander to Igbos.
No, I remember I went to Nigeria in 2014, 2015, because it was like December. So it was December and January.
Oh, you went in the
and I remember that I stayed at this like compound. There were at least 30 different family members in this one unit. And I was so not used to being around people all the time. Oh my gosh, like there were no doors on the rooms. And so I remember I'm like, okay, I'm gonna go to my room. And then they just follow me and sit on the bed. I'm like, oh gosh, I'm not used to this level of relationship. And so it really made me recognize how outside of the United States that, people are so much more relationship rich than us, that you have to be able to work with other people. You have to be able to resolve conflicts. Like that is just a part of life. But I think in a Western or American sense, isolation can almost be encouraged and reinforced. And oftentimes we don't have the skill sets to resolve conflict, right? People ghost each other all the time, or, just don't know how to resolve conflict. There's a really good book for Black people in conflict called Lubrication for Liberation by Baba Senyika. But I just, again, am thinking about actually learning the skill sets to be in relationships with other people. And I know that certain things like building your emotional intelligence can be key. But you have to have a tribe. That is human nature, right? The survival of the tribe, and especially from an African-centered perspective, you can never be healthy if you don't have your tribe. That and how much your tribe's health impacts yours, right? You can't be healthy in a lot of traditional African societies if your mother isn't healthy, right? Because that's going to impact you. And so I think that there can be explorations of African cultural systems that can address some of our collective mental health needs. So I find myself going to look in the past a lot to see how these things were handled, right? Because mental health services aren't new, right? There were always ways that Black people were taking care of their mental health needs. It's just this system has disrupted our relationships that were quite healing to us in the past. So I think it actually learning to build relationships and keep relationships is a skill. But it's very challenging then when you're already in a state of distress to be able to build it back up like Kanye. But yeah.
Yeah, my mom said this. My mom said this is like the loneliest country she's ever been to, because in Nigeria, like you could see a young person can see an old person just sitting on the side of the road, and the young person would go talk to him. But here in the U.S., you kind of avoid it. I feel like down south is a little different. It's a little more homelier. Like people are a lot more open to having those relationships, but especially on the East Coast, people just don't really want to talk, or they're very individualistic, and that's just American society in general, right? And I guess this kind of leads into another question I might have. What have you been seeing in your practice around COVID-related illnesses, or just issues? So a lot of people are in isolation now, not being able to leave or see the people they want to see. How is that actually affecting the population?
You all have some really amazing questions.
We're prepared.
You do that thing.
Yeah, and I'm just gonna go back to the Nigeria story real quick. Yeah, because I was doing lots of push-ups there. You were just saying if you see an older person, you got to get down, do a full push-up to acknowledge the other person, right? They're very present. What I've been noticing since I changed to completely virtual, right? I have not seen a client face-to-face in months. A lot of my clients are talking about dating. That's one of the biggest stressors right now in terms of how do you actually date right now. That most of my clients I see are between 20s to 40s. And so this is a peak time in developing romantic relationships. It's often a negotiation of who to trust to let into your space. Should you see the person? Just feeling like how often should people see each other? Like touch, all these different things have been coming up a lot. Yeah, I would say dating has been the biggest concern. And then for the people who are in relationships, just even feeling frustrated with that person, in terms of them being the only source of support and contact when they're used to seeing so many other people. Like extroverts are struggling right now. And so Keegan. I know quite a few of my clients.
Keegan.
No, I'm struggling.
I'm an introvert, so it's been working a little bit, but after a while, you start getting a little stir crazy. And like, I do miss my friends, just having that conversation with them, because the thing is with extroverts, they get energy from being in groups. Introverts like being in groups, but they get their energy being by themselves. So I'm just getting all this energy, and then it's like, where am I spending it? Just at home with myself. But then I started doing like picnics and stuff like that, and just like going out there, but still, it's still not, I can imagine some people still struggling with that just as a whole.
It is. And to, related to financial distress,
oh man,
and like employment issues, I see a lot of Black professionals and just, almost working in excess now.
Yeah.
That before they were always working a lot, but now they're expected to be in 50 meetings a week and, all these different things where time and boundaries have been a real struggle to say, even though I'm not in a meeting doesn't mean that I want to be in a meeting with you. So I know that work stress has manifested in that way because there's no work-life balance, right? They're always on call for their jobs. Parenting issues have come up a lot, especially with back to school and what to do with children and how to keep them engaged and disciplined. Yeah, there's so many topics.
Yeah, you mentioned a lot, and I also want to touch back on something you mentioned earlier. It was around emotional intelligence. So that's been pretty much a buzzword or buzz phrase as of recent. And can you define what emotional intelligence is in your perspective, and then also how does one go about improving it? Just like how physical health, we can go lift weights, mental health, you gave us some ideas. intelligence, we read books, we learn, but how do you actually build emotional intelligence?
So emotional intelligence can be scored almost like a regular IQ test. So people can Google emotional intelligence tests and take it. And so there are ways to increase your emotional intelligence. But emotional intelligence basically is how well you are able to self-regulate your feelings. So if you're feeling angry, do you know what to do to calm yourself down? If you're feeling sad, do you know what to do to cheer yourself up? Do you know why you feel that way? Emotional intelligence includes self-awareness in terms of being able to identify exactly how you feel. Emotional intelligence includes how to interpret social cues. Sometimes people can misread or have certain biases. And so, yeah, there are different legs to emotional intelligence. And just like, you can have a weak muscle in your body, that building it can strengthen the whole body too, the body system. So if you're really good at self-awareness and you know exactly how you feel all the time, but you're really poor at self-regulation, then you're going to be knowing how depressed you are all the time, but not feeling like you can change it. So basically what happens with emotional intelligence, it's an unpacking process to study yourself and other people and recognize what things to say, what behaviors to do to shift sort of the emotional energy of you or other people. So people who are high in emotional intelligence tend to do really well in life because they have more satisfying relationships, that they feel healthier, tend to have career success because then people want to work with them in their various fields. So there's lots of books out on it, and workbooks in particular that can give homework assignments on activities to engage in to increase emotional intelligence.
One thing, because I remember when I was going to therapy, one thing that I struggled with was having like I was very logical. So like if you look at like one of those like Myers-Briggs tests, I'm like an INTP, so I'm pretty much like a robot at times. And I learned just from like, yeah, it's terrible. It's terrible. But one thing that I learned was like I'm always trying to problem solve. So if someone comes to me with a problem, I just want to solve it. And one little change that I made, which made like a mountain a difference, was just asking, how does that problem make you feel?
Okay.
And then just that person just hearing that would just like therapy, they'll just like spill it out. Then you don't really have to solve it. You can solve it probably tomorrow or probably next week, but the fact that they have a place to actually vent, right? I think that helped me build my emotional intelligence, is knowing exactly when to solve and then when to actually just appeal to the person's emotional side, especially if they feel like they're going all over the place. They don't really have anywhere to really go. They're just spewing things. It's just, how does it make you feel? And that's also the self speak. So I just did a little workshop for Keegan's company that he works at, and it was around like mindfulness. And I was like, the importance of regulating your self speak. So you can say horrible things to yourself, but ask yourself why.
Yeah.
Why do you feel Why do you feel that way about yourself? And then once you start diving deep, you're just like, oh, that's pretty BS. It is BS. It's not really true. And I'm just making up these stories, and I just got to push past them. And then once you understand that you're periodically going to speak ill of yourself, knowing that having that self-awareness, you can actually go forward rather than just letting it make you stagnant. So
See, you already knew all this emotional intelligence.
But
Just trying to create conversation. Yeah, because I think one of the key questions, right, are to be able to identify the feelings, right, and encourage other people to identify their feelings. But also, you brought up the major question in mental health. If you take nothing else from this conversation, take this point. It's so important that we ask why. So oftentimes we're focused on the how, like how events happened or how we feel, but we need to understand why we feel that and why things happened. that is going to disrupt sort of the loop that we have. Because if you've ever been around kids, they ask like a good 7 whys, and then you get to where like, I don't know how the TV gets in the TV. Like, you know what I mean? Like, it just keeps going over and over until it gets to, you know, the root. And a lot of times what we do in our lives, we do shadow work where, you know, we have some concern or problem, but we're doing things that's to sort of then mimic things that can make us feel better rather than dealing with the actual trigger or concern. So, you know, being on social media is sort of shadow work. Like, you want to feel connected to other people. That's natural, that's human, but it almost becomes addictive if that's the only way that you're connecting. And really, again, getting into why am I on Instagram 7 hours a day? Yes, that has happened to me. When you get the, you know, the hours and insights and you're like 7 hours, this is like a full-time job, right? When you look at the hours a week, how long you're on your phone, it is a straight up full-time job. And so to really understand why am I on Instagram 7 hours and just keep unpacking the why until getting to like a deeper root of it.
Absolutely.
Definitely.
Absolutely.
So we're almost at the time. So just want to ask 2 more questions. And you've been awesome, by the way. So
perfect.
Thank you for the word of affirmation, the words of affirmation. I love language.
Mine's is active service. Like that's mine. I've gone through this too. I'm married, had to go through the whole love language stuff.
That's my number 1. Acts of service.
Active service. There you go. See, that's why me and you are cool. Okay, so one of the things that we want to understand a little bit more is, let's say mental health is like a spectrum, right? I think that I've heard it described as it being a spectrum. How do you, if you were to define things, the spectrum of mental health, what would you say is the minor to the major? You know, like how would you define that spectrum?
Well, I want to go with actually Louis Farrakhan's definition of mental health. So I know you don't necessarily think of him as a psychologist, but in 1996, he spoke to the Association of Black Psychologists, and I've read about it, and the definition I thought was great. He said mental health is living in accord with the nature, aim, and purpose of your creation. And so basically I see mental health then thinking about alignment, where in terms of that whole spectrum, where you are almost outside of yourself, I think causes like the greatest amount of distress versus being totally, I'm using a line, but totally satisfied in how you navigate your thoughts, feelings, and behaviors. So I'm just almost thinking about like feeling outside of yourself versus being aligned. In that sort of the complexity and spectrum of mental health. So how do you get yourself to a space of feeling connected to yourself, feeling connected to your community, feeling a spiritual connection. So I think that's where I want to go with that.
Okay.
Got it. Nice. I guess our last question, because this has been a topic that I've been interested in as of recent. So the use of like psychedelic drugs and medication within the just within the treatment of mental illness, PTSD, past traumas, depression, end of life acceptance, and things like that. I wanted to kind of get your thoughts on that and how it's actually emerging now in science, as well as, you know, I don't see it as prevalent within the Black community. You know, it's still very like, it's a little taboo. But can you talk a little bit about that? Yeah.
You're asking for my consent. Yeah, I watched that that Gwyneth Paltrow show on Netflix where they try different healing. So one of them was a mushroom psychedelic episode. I recommend to watch it because, you know, they had therapists sit with the people as they tried out the different drugs. But I've known of different Black martial artists who have studied mushrooms very deeply and have identified, and I'm not privy to the studies, but argued that there are certain mushrooms that someone can take where they go back and revisit their points of trauma and relive it in a way where the trauma didn't happen, or relive it in a way where they work through the trauma in that moment. So, you know, these are highly trained, highly spiritual people. I am not there. I need to go through further initiations, but I do think that there are certain chemical compositions that could heal our brains and our bodies and our spirits. I'm just not there yet, and I want to figure that out.
Great. Great.
You seem disappointed, but
no,
go ahead,
no,
take it. That's what you wanted to hear.
Yeah.
So no,
I definitely think
cool.
under a trained professional who, you know, has intergenerational training on using certain herbs or plants. I think that there are plants that exist in this world. Yes.
Yeah, I didn't have a guide when I did it. I didn't tell Keegan that. Keegan I didn't tell you, but yeah, that was like last month. But I was like, I get what you're saying. Like what you're saying about the martial artists and stuff. I can actually see that occurring. Like I like the things that I saw. It was just like kind of mind bending, but it was so real. But you don't feel high or anything. Like you see it as what it is. So I just tell you about one part of it. I'm listening to a Tribe Called Quest, and then Q-Tip says something like, "What's hip hop without the violence?" And when he said that, like my mind just like went all the way back to slavery. Like, I saw slavery. Like I was in the bush, like watching them, like in the fields, and I saw like an eye overwatching it all. And it was like a blue eye, just watching everything. And I was like it just like made sense. Like people said, like when you think about hip hop, like without the violence, you think, okay, yeah, we talk about a lot of violence, but we endured so much violence through our life as a people. That's the result of it. Like you're feeling all of that coming together. So that kind of put 2 and 2 together for me. And would I do it again? Maybe, I don't know, but it was an eye-opening experience. And I was just very curious on how they actually use it in a medical setting. And what your take on is, you being like a young psychologist as well, and how that's going to actually turn out in the future if you see that actually growing.
Yeah, as a result of this conversation, I need to read about 200 more books. Now I'm like, oh, I need to address this. So I'm definitely still learning and growing in my craft. And I do plan in the future to study under traditional healers on the continent. That's one of my goals, to sort of get like Fulbright and to really honor the methods and strategies of mental health in traditional African societies. So that's one of my goals.
Awesome.
Yeah,
that's great.
Awesome.
So we're at the hour. It's 8:01. Dr. Field, this has been awesome. This was like
it's eye-opening.
I'm so happy that I DM'd you. This is awesome. So we're gonna go back to the lab, and we're gonna chop up this video and get it ready. We'll put some pieces together so you can use them on your page as well. And you know, like once we are finished with the video and then also like the quick summary, we'll send it over to you just for review, and then we'll take it from there.
All right, thank you so much. This was therapeutic for me.
Thank you.
I feel charged up, like, okay.